I want to welcome everybody. My name is Kelly Lendsay. I'm President and CEO of Indigenous Works, and welcome to today's Thought Leadership webinar. And I'm pleased to be joined by Craig Hall and Stephen Lindley. I'm talking to you today from Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan in very, very chilly, cold Saskatoon. And as you know, we have a polar vortex through the west, but we're staying warm indoors here. You know, before I get into the presentation today, we have almost 150 people registered. And I got to tell you, I'm just going to give you some insights on the type of companies that have and organizations that have joined today. It's really quite a mix of people who are attracted to this topic in terms of an examination of Indigenous employment policies. But, you know, we've got John DeGiacomo, an Indigenous Employment Center. In the transportation area, we have got Air Canada. Telecommunications, our friends at Bell have joined us. In the health and emergency services area, our friends at Calian. In the public service, Correction Services Canada is on board. In the education sector, we've got groups like Dalhousie University, Edwards School of Business at the University of Saskatchewan, Hill and Leven School of Business in Regina, and Sask Polytechnic here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. We've got Indigenous corporations like the Gitxsan Development Corporation here today. We've got, in the power sector, New Brunswick Power out in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Welcome. In the mining sector, our friends at Newmont are on board. Banking sector, Scotiabank. In the energy sector, Syncrude. And in the arts, we have the Toronto International Film Festival, better known as TIFF. Finally, I don't know what's happening in Alberta, folks, but the University of Alberta has, I think, a dozen or 15 people registered on this webinar. So great interest from U of A. Big shout out to you. And finally, in the retail sector, Walmart. So what's really interesting about this topic is that it has attracted people from every sector, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. So let's go to the first slide, and I'm going to tell you what we're going to cover in today's webinar. First of all, we're going to look at what do we mean by policy, what are different types of Indigenous policies, what do policies do, what's the purpose of policies, how are they developed, what's the current state of Indigenous policies. And I'll tell you something, this is some of the most formative of research done on policies, which we started a few years ago. And really, this is an untapped area. And then we'll talk about policy design and give you some suggestions in terms of this. So let's go to the next slide and look at the first part, which is, you know, what is policy? So many of you, of course, on this call, you may have been involved in policy development, might be involved in policy reviews, but there are deliberate systems that are a set of principles to guide your decisions as an organization to achieve certain outcomes or to guide the way in which you go about your operations. It's a statement of intent implemented as a procedure or protocol. Some people are policy heavy is one of the phrases. You all have things like privacy policies and so on, but who's responsible for them? Well, they're typically the responsibility of executive members. Often they are reviewed and have to be reviewed annually or biannually by the board of directors to ensure that there's compliance. Policy development may be undertaken by committees and board members. Policy development can be delegated to senior level managers, and perhaps that's a role that some of you have that are on the call today. And finally, policy can serve as a guideline for operational decision making. And this is really, I think, one of the strongest aspects of policies is it is a guide that does help with certain decision-making protocols. Finally, policies are helpful in highlighting the rules, the values, and the beliefs of your organization, in addition to the policies and practices at the time. If you think of things like anti-harassment policies, anti-discrimination policies, and so on. So now, to give you a real snapshot, we're going to look at types of policies. And this is a very interesting graphic that has mapped out a pretty exhaustive list of what we have seen as Indigenous inclusion policies across Canada. So Craig, over to you to elaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, at the very top there, you mentioned, Kelly, that this is a new area. We really don't see much written about Indigenous policies in any of the academic literature or just about anywhere for that matter. So what we did a couple of years back is we started to collect different examples of policies and we started to categorize them. So in the broadest sense, these are all what we would refer to as inclusion policies. And at the top right, we look at things like the bundle of employment, workforce, and workplace policies. We see examples across the country in use of corporate social responsibility, that CSR bundle of inclusion policies. And then there's a broader set that are governed by Indigenous relations policies. And these are popular in the resource sector as an example. And then furthermore, there's also the area of procurement and diversity supplier kinds of policies. So we looked at these and we found that, we chose examples from across the countries and different sectors and so on. And there was about 25 different examples that we came up with. And some of them if you would look at them, you would see they're basically aspirational sort of policies. Others are more detailed and they have procedures and tracking things attached to them. So the complexion of the policy is quite different. And some policies have obviously been developed in response to very specific issues that have come about in the workplace, while others are more strategic in nature. So an example of the first one would be, you notice there's a smudging policy. And so this is popular in some of the areas. Universities and colleges have been quick to adopt these kinds of examples. And in the resource sector, we see, again, very strategic looking policies. There's quite a range of things, and this is the first effort to kind of catalog them and create a kind of typology around them. So it's kind of exciting, and this will be research that I hope we can continue, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along here. But what do policies do? They actually provide direction for an organization in a whole variety of ways. As we note, they guide organizational behaviors. They define the resources with which certain organizational goals can be achieved. They define the roles and responsibilities in various areas of business. And they help identify significant issues affecting organizational success. Define the scope or spheres within which decisions can be taken by subordinates in an organization. So the whole area of, authority, delegation of authority, these are often prescribed in the context of policy. If you were to set about the process of developing a policy within your organization, you quickly realize that the task of developing policy and getting approval is very challenging, and it requires a tremendous amount of consultation internally and discussion with different business units that will be affected by or part of the policy. So we offer some considerations here that you might think of when you're contemplating the idea of developing a policy in a broad area or in response to a certain issue. So what are the top 3 or 4 issues that are driving the need for the policy? And is there uniform agreement on these issues throughout the organization? And is there an area from within the organization that these issues have surfaced from? And what are the top 3 or 5 principles that will guide the policy? What values does the organization hold as important? So what's the overarching policy framework and the values underlying that? And what way do these values inform the development of the new policy? And a good sort of exercise to go through is sort of, what is the policy going to be called? It's a policy to, and if you can get that far, it will start to form the basis for need and definition of policy. So the last sort of background points here, in terms of policy design, There's a variety of things to think about. It's important to, as I say, discuss the different business units, what the policy is about and how they'll be affected and so on. And it's very important to work with different parts of the organization well in advance of the ratification of the policy as to how it might be interpreted by them, how it might be measured by them, how it might be it might impact them, and so on. So what role will users of the policy have in shaping the actual policy? That's a very acceptable approach. Will the policy be enforceable or advisory in nature? We covered that. And what are the consequences of not following or deviating from the policy? So will the policy have teeth? How will the policy be interpreted and implemented by employees, the board, subcontractors, etc.? There's just a variety of things to be considered in policy design. The last point is what procedures, rules, and controls will be needed to implement and support the policy.
Glad you're enjoying the PowerPoint, the webinar, folks. Make sure you're on mute. And Craig, I'll go into this slide. Craig, you mentioned the smudging policy.
Yes.
And in the academic sector, another place where you're starting to see these types of practices being brought in is in the healthcare sector. So as you know, in some hospitals, they'll have different rooms for Muslims, Catholics, and so on. But now they have these smudging rooms for people to have sweetgrass and sage and so on. And look at this in light of the recent report that came out in British Columbia by Dr. Mary Ellen Trappell on the level of racism in the BC healthcare sector. Or you look at the unfortunate death of the First Nations woman in the Montreal hospital. So you sort of look at where and how can policy be a driver of change? Can it be? One of the things that we're seeing is that, and this comes from research that we did on what we call the engagement gap. We did a study of 511 large and medium-sized companies, and we asked them about their overall strategies and partnerships. And really what we found is that 85% of Canadian companies have no Indigenous engagement strategies, practices, or plans. And in fact, of the majority that are engaged, which was 15%, the majority of those come from the resource sector. Now, having said that, this particular slide shows some examples of what people, these are managers working inside everyday companies in Canada, when they were interviewed in this questionnaire, some of their responses to this whole issue of Indigenous strategy more broadly. They said things like, well, we never thought about it. No one's ever asked us. It's up to leadership. We don't reach out to any groups. There's a lack of opportunity to engage. Nothing formal coming from head office. We don't discriminate. There's no incentives to do so. There's no long-term plan for us. There's no reason to do so. So these comments, and by the way, we're going to share this PowerPoint deck with you. I think it really underscores the disconnect there is around a company and its intention to develop Indigenous engagement strategies and perhaps the managers working inside the companies. So there's lots of work to be done on strategy, practices, and perhaps policy, and we're gonna elaborate on that. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of, as we now look a little more deeply into Indigenous employment policies, you want to look at, well, how narrow or broad do you want to frame this policy? Is it specific to, for example, just employment? Or are you looking at other areas of your workplace inclusion, which could include procurement? It could include corporate social responsibilities, community relations, environment. I mean, those are some of the areas, of course, that you could be touching on. And again, looking at the focus or how broad you want to look at your particular policies. You're hearing a lot in the news about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color lives matter. And we're hearing more about companies reacting, especially to the Black Lives Movement matter. You're starting to see a number of new initiatives pop up in the United States and Canada. And indeed, some companies are actually reviewing this and their policies in light of this. You might be doing the same here. I think a third point here is that is employment at the core issue of reconciliation? And we know that we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's calling on companies to do more, educating your employees, creating employment opportunities, adopt UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and address education in terms of racism and inclusive workplaces. So again, it starts to look at where and how this policy dimension falls within the company will be something you want to explore. I think the other area then, number 4, is how urgent is the need for policy? I mean, if policy was going to miraculously change everything, well, then we'd all just do it. So there is a role for policy, but in terms of the time and energy to develop policy, doing policy in the absence of a strategy, we don't think is that well thought out. We think that strategy does come in advance of policy, but we'll be looking at, again, the urgency, sort of the nature of your own company in terms of how policy driven it is, and whether you're able to sort of see that link between policy and some real change in the company. So, Greg, let's have you now look at, again, this is really an untapped area, right? Very little is known about Indigenous policies in Canada. Just elaborate on this a bit more.
Yeah, so so far in the webinar, we've really talked about 3 things. We're talking about the design of the policy, the framing of the policy, and then what I call the plumbing of the policy, which is how it's put together and how it works and who it affects. So this is an aspect of plumbing, so to speak, in the sense that you have to figure out who this is going to apply to. So if we're looking at Indigenous employment, and we really want to highlight that as an imperative within the company or organization, and decide that policy is the approach to be taken, well, how do you construct that? Does the contracting and procurement of different subcontractors within the organization also have a bearing on your employment goals? And so that too is an aspect of how the policy could be constructed from an employment perspective. Then there are other aspects such as codes of ethics and behaviors, the practices and approaches when working with Indigenous people, the protocols, business development. These are all aspects of the coverage or the scope of the policy. So these are important construction matters when it comes to policy development. But as I mentioned, this is really an area that really would be useful to do some more research on because, as I mentioned, no one's really collected or gone out to collect different samples of policies. And so we don't really know what the impact of policy has been on, say, employment or employment strategy and the outcomes. We don't really have a good understanding of what the difference is in the policies, the Indigenous policies in the public or private or NGO sector, how it's applied or constructed in Indigenous or non-Indigenous organizations. And then, of course, in different sectors. There's a big difference in the policy framework and the way policies are developed in the banking sector versus the resource sector. So we don't really know whether the presence of a policy is a good indicator of whether the organization is a place for Indigenous people to seek a career, or whether it's a good indication that they are an employer of choice. Many, many things we don't yet understand about policies. So towards the end of the webinar, we might invite you to help us in developing some more research in this area. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Last point I'd mention here before I turn it over to Steve is we take the view that it's important to get the strategy down first. So it's rare that companies or organizations starting off in this journey would come full blown with a policy and say this is what we're trying to achieve and so on, more likely that you're wanting to develop some strategies, some key practices, hone those, and then get it done. And then over time, it could emerge into a strategy statement of some sort. And that actually could help you. If you're a large organization, policies are a great way of enlisting different parts of your organization towards very concrete goals, and it can help you measure and assess the progress that you're making in certain key areas. So over to Steve. He's going to give you some further tips on policy development and talk a little bit perhaps about his own experience in policy making.
You're on mute.
I guess it would help to have the mic open.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. Steve Lindley. I think I know some of you. You may know me from my days at S&C. You may know me as a co-chair of Indigenous Works, or from various other circuits that we've all kind of shared. Not so much anymore, but certainly in the good old days. Craig, I'm actually going to be sharing some of my experience from two angles, really. One angle was I spent many years as Vice President of Aboriginal Northern Affairs at S&C-Lavalin, which is an international, very large engineering and construction company. And I was actually champion of a policy development process that got to authorization. So some of what I'm going to be sharing is going to be from that. I've also spent my entire career in consulting, ostensibly in the electricity and resource sectors. And I've seen a lot of policy implementation and execution from various clients. Currently, I'm working very closely with Hydro One, and Indigenous policy is very important to companies like Hydro One because they need community relations as part of their engagement strategy and their ability to be able to talk about projects and get projects working and to maintain community relations once the projects are up and operating. It's very important to companies like that. One thing I noticed, and Kelly spoke to it earlier, is the diversity of the group here. We've got educators, government, we've got corporate, we've got not-for-profit, we've got banks, ECDEV, kind of all over the place, and everybody's going to be motivated by different things when they approach the policy platform. But one thing we tend to know is that you wouldn't be approaching the policy platform if you didn't have a good reason to do it. And so I'm assuming everybody in this room has either been challenged with what that might look like and maybe challenged with developing a policy, or you might be challenged with trying to implement and account for policy that's already in place. So we're going to spend a few minutes and we're going to focus a little bit on policy development here. So I apologize to those that already have their policies. But I think the conversation around this would be helpful to anybody. Craig, I'd kind of like to start with the next slide first, if I could. So why do a policy? You know, what is... Hi, can we go on mute for the folks that are enjoying the webinar? What are some of the benefits?
Tonight, but because I traveled, I'm now in this isolation box.
You flew all this way just to watch the show from a weird box?
Hello, folks.
I didn't know about the box at the time.
Somebody's watching TV.
Okay. Well, I'd offer to help, but we're live on TV.
Thank you. So there's a number of benefits, and you probably are all familiar with these. Achieving them may not always be as easy as it is to write it down. If you are successful at getting that policy that you want in place, you know that you've been doing a lot of soul searching as an organization. You've had a lot of difficult discussions, maybe some disagreements along the way as to what's important and what isn't. And by the time you get to the end of that policy road, you've matured and you've actually come to the point where you can kind of wear it as a badge of honor, both internally and externally. You know, I know some organizations want these policies so that they can demonstrate to potential clients or customers that they're thinking in a good way, and this is a way to demonstrate it. A lot of our clients used to say, "Do you have a policy?" And for years we had to say no, and it was very difficult. Why not? So it's a badge of honor. There's no doubt about that, and the scars are worth showing off. Of course, credibility and reputational value are very important to everybody. Every organization wants a good reputation. And once you've been through the policy process and you've come to an agreement as an organization as to what that's going to look like, and once you've decided what your customers or your clients or your whoever your target base is going to be happy with it, then you're obviously going to improve your reputation. It improves commitments and accountabilities in areas that you might not have had in the organization previously. It's not easy, especially in the HR world, sometimes to count some of these things, to see trends in some of these things. As Craig said earlier, there hasn't been a lot of experience with this. So starting to develop those metrics is going to be good for discipline, and it's going to be good for accountability. And, finally, you're going to get to know a lot of people in the organization that you maybe didn't. You're going to be coordinating. You're going to be finding out how to access expertise and resources within the organization that you may not have known existed before. And you may be building a different team than you ever anticipated. That certainly happened for me at SNC. We ended up with a team of people across the country that were committed to actually helping to develop and implement the policy. And that team actually met regularly, and it didn't exist before the development of that conversation. Okay, if we could go back, Craig. So there's no one size fits all. Okay, every organization is different. Every organization has their different targets and reasons for doing this. And I guess what we're going to be doing for the next few slides is talking sort of from a generic perspective. So I'm not trying to speak to any one sample group or another in the room. It's just basically from experience. One thing I want to say off the top, policies, some people like to keep their policies very high level, aspirational. They like to be able to hang it on the back of the elevator door. It's one page, and it reflects the company's or organization's highest aspirations with respect to the topic. And that's not just for an Indigenous policy. I mean, it can apply to any kind of a policy. But that's, of course, not how you implement the policy. And the hard work, to me, is not getting the aspirational part right. The hard part is the mechanics, the plumbing, as Craig called it. What I often call the procedures. One thing that we do know about policies is that they can be very difficult and challenging to change. So if you keep them very simple, you may not have to change them very often. However, your metrics and your procedures, your protocols may change quite often. You may want to be driving them in a very dynamic way as you gain experience and implement your policy. So oftentimes you'll drop your authorization level for the procedures so that you don't need board of directors approval, and you can actually be dynamic with how you go about those procedures, which would have most of the things that your senior management is going to want you to count. How many, how much, how good, these are the accountabilities of the policy that would be contained within a procedure. So just some of the things that we usually see in both policies and procedures, because they do go hand in hand. Obviously, the overall goal, your position statement, why are you doing it? What are you trying to achieve? Foundational principles. These are the aspirational goals of the organization. Scope, what's it applying to? We had a big challenge when I was doing my policy because we were a global company, and there was a lot of talk about, is this a policy for the company, or is this just a policy for Canada? Are we talking about trying to implement something across the globe when it's going to be very difficult to establish that procedure? So scope is very important. Craig mentioned earlier, is it only about employment? Or are you going to have employment and procurement? Are you going to have community relations. What is the breadth of your policy? And that goes back to your goal. Definitions, of course, authority and accountability, which is largely going to be driven, by the policies and procedures of your organization. That isn't often debatable. It's a given. Relationship between this policy and others, and I'll give you a good example of where policies can collide. You might have a diversity and inclusion policy, and that diversity and inclusion policy basically says all minorities should be treated in a respectful manner, and there are going to be different things we're going to do with respect to minorities that we may not do to the broad population. We're going to make exceptions, and we're going to go out of our way. Well, some people within some HRs might say, well, how do you treat Indigenous people separately from everybody else? Our diversity and inclusion policy covers everybody. Why do you think you need a separate policy? And I can tell you that was one of the most difficult challenges I had at SNC, was getting around that and trying to argue, the constitutional rights and all the things you people know about that do make the Indigenous community distinct. But it can be a challenging discussion, right? So how you actually make them fit. Procurement's another one. Oh yeah, we've always known how to do procurement. But when it comes to Indigenous procurement, it's going to look a lot different. And the people in the resource sector know exactly how different that can be. Where you buy your pencils can be different, right? And how you approach the supply chain, the Indigenous supply chain, is going to be different. How to review, when to review, that takes me back to my point about aspirational versus procedural. And of course, how you're going to report, and that becomes very important in terms of accountability. So I guess we're going to skip to the next one, right? So a few little tips. And again, I'm not trying to force feed one size fits all here. These are really discussion points. Make sure your executive leadership is on board and they have mandated the policy. Absolutely, but oftentimes it's not executive management that has identified the need and purpose for the policy. It might have come out of the trenches. And the folks in the branch offices are the ones that are screaming for a policy because they're getting asked every day, why don't you have a policy? Why don't you procure from Indigenous suppliers? So sometimes it's an up and down process. You might have pressure from below, and you might have pressure from your board of directors. And it kind of squeezes the middle management and the senior, what I call the senior middle management, who are ultimately going to be accountable for this policy. And they have to be able to buy into this, or of course it's not going to work. But the pressure to develop the policy may not actually come from the top in the first place. Define your business case. Everybody in this room knows how important that is, and everybody in the room is going to have a different approach. It might be how to increase business in the Indigenous community. It might be how to increase business with clients that are working in the Indigenous community. It might be about how to align better with your customer base. It might be about improving community relations, like with Hydro One. It might be about improving your reputation and your corporate culture. It might be about employment equity, and it might be about access to resources. And for the educators in the room, I know I've worked with universities. It could be about just simply being more Indigenous with your programs so that you can attract more Indigenous students and you can keep them, you can attract more faculty. And this was a really big goal for the universities that I spoke to about policy. Find a place in the organization where it's going to get launched. My suggestion is, and probably everybody in this room knows this, is that you need a champion. Somebody has to own it. Somebody has to be the one that's going to take the brunt of the initial challenges, getting people together, figuring out the business case, all of these things. You really need a champion. You may end up with more than one champion as you go through the process, but I think you do need one champion. And then, of course, as you develop your procedures, who's going to own it is going to become part of your accountability. So different business units within your organization may have different contributions to that ownership. Next slide, please, Craig. So we talked about how your policy fits with others, how HR talks to procurement, And, you know, in a lot of organizations, HR never talked to procurement before. So, you know, these are going to be interesting conversations. And then you've got your environment team or your Indigenous relations team that may never have really thought about HR. And all of a sudden you've got employment targets in your Indigenous policy when you were really just trying to strike a way of improving community relations and maybe the supply chain, the Indigenous supply chain. So these are all interesting conversations that can come up as you go through your process. Is your approval process clear? Most organizations, the approval process is clear, and if it isn't, you'll find out quickly. Is your organization going to be able to live up to its policy commitments? You have to, or you don't have a policy. The worst thing that can happen to your credibility and reputation is if you have a policy that you don't live up to and somebody finds that you're not meeting it. Now, that's sometimes easier said than done. And I was always told, back off, back up, and make it simpler and make it easier to achieve so that you don't miss your commitments, right? You can always increase them later. And that's what the beauty of having a procedure is, that you can make it a very dynamic process and you can increase your targets, whatever those might be, as you achieve, right? Setting goals and targets that are not achievable are also going to be demoralizing for the people who own the policy and are being maybe even compensated for their ability to meet the targets. So you want to keep good morale. You want that policy to be popular. Systems challenges may need to be addressed. For example, you may need to introduce changes to your employment systems. This is basically what I was talking about in terms of the dynamic nature of your procedures. Next slide, please. Is the timing right? You'll know really quickly if it isn't. If you are the champion, if you're somebody who's maintaining an existing policy, you'll have your finger on the pulse of whether or not the policy is doing what the corporation wants to do, and you'll be monitoring ways that may have to, it may have to be changed. But the timing is going to come from your attempt to gain consensus. And this can be very challenging in a large organization. I suppose it can be very challenging in any organization, but you do need a certain amount of consensus in order for that policy to be respected within the organization and to be implemented the way you as the champion want that policy to be implemented. Have you defined the right Indigenous development or employment or inclusion policy for your needs? I can't imagine getting to the end of the policy process and not being able to say yes to that question. There will be a lot of push and pull as you go through the process as to which aspects of the policy are more important, which senior executives are going to be more driven to support the policy. Not all senior executives may be prone to supporting the policy, especially if they're the ones that are being held accountable, like procurement folks, who may not see a whole lot of advantages in their little department with respect to the relationship that the organization has to the Indigenous community. And yet, they're going to be tasked with doing a lot of the accountable activities that are required by the procedure. So you have to try and draw some of that consensus in, and you might have to back off a little bit in terms of some of the expectations. But you should be able to answer that question yes at the time when you go for authorization approvals. Is the language clear? One thing I learned in my path is that the lawyers should not own the policy language. Lawyers, of course, are instrumental in ensuring that you've managed your risk. They're instrumental in ensuring that you're well protected, that you're not making, setting expectations that might hurt the organization if you fail to meet them. They're going to manage reputational risk, and they're going to be all over you in terms of your potential to fail, which lawyers, as we all know, love to do. What happens if it doesn't work? And your reputational risk becomes something very important. So let the lawyers ask their questions, but in my experience, let the people that are going to implement the policy write the language. Develop a really strong commercial document and then let the lawyers go at it. Thanks for your time.
Stephen, Excellent. You covered 10 powerful tips to help guide organizations in thinking about policy development. And folks, now in sort of the summary here, what I want to do is this work, as you can see, we've covered a range of items and topics here. If you're at the stage where you want help with your policy needs, then give us a shout. You might be at the design stage, the build stage, or the review stage. We have been working with companies. As Craig pointed out, this is a relatively new area. We're inviting people, if you're interested in this area, we think more research needs to be done on what's the link between policy and impact. What are emerging Indigenous policies? And so we started this work. It's about 2 years old. And if any of you have a very keen interest, we'd welcome to be part of a research group to look at this area in more in-depth as we go forward. Craig, over to the next slide. So I want to say thank you to everybody for joining. And I think in terms of going to the Q&A, I want to put up the next slide, which is this great graphic, which Craig talked about, this mapping of Indigenous policies that we've been able to track so far. In today's webinar, where we started was we gave you an overview of policy. What is policy? What's the purpose of policy? How do you go about designing and developing the policy? We gave you a picture on the state of Indigenous policy, where it's at, and this picture really captures it. And finally, Stephen did a great job giving you 10 tips that your organization can undertake for policy development. So I hope that was helpful. This is the first policy webinar of its kind on Indigenous policy. So you're part of a formative webinar first. And we're going to open up to any questions and comments that people may have. You can use the chat function and type in a question if you wish. Or you can also go off mute and pose your question.
Good afternoon. I'm wondering if I could just speak candidly instead of doing a written in the chat. My name is Elkia. I come from an organization in Southern Ontario called NEPAM, Niagara Peninsula Aboriginal Area Management Board. Perhaps you have heard of us. We are exclusively for Indigenous youth employability. I also am the chairperson on an agency called or a non-for-profit called First Works Youth Council. I have a question encircling tokenism when it comes to policy making or policy formatting, and how a company or an agency of any size or magnitude would be able to really format and adhere to a lot of youth, especially in the trade sector particularly. That's something that the youth are being coming forward as we're transitioning from, the high school age, the post-secondary age. They want to ensure when they're getting into the workforce and they're looking at these policies that it's not tokenism.
Yeah, great question. We know NEPAM well. We've actually partnered with you in the past on different projects. And what's the first name of the gentleman, Mr. Keys? He's one of your founding champions with NEPAM.
Yeah, he's on to bigger and brighter futures now. Our executive director currently is Jason Shawana. So he's aware that I'm here. I'm his assistant actually. So he's aware that we're here sitting today. But yes.
Tremendous. Well, you first of all, like I said, we have worked with you folks in the past. You've done some very innovative projects and initiatives. You're raising the issue of tokenism, and tokenism goes to what Stephen was talking to about reputation management. And I think this is something that people are going to be very concerned about. There are going to be questions internally. You may have been criticized already before, or sometimes these are in the media. And so this is, I think, Stephen, I'm going to pitch to you first to elaborate on her question a bit more about tokenism and what I think in terms of policy conflicts and.
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that organizations are static enough that one answer fits all times, right? So you might have a group that developed the policy in your organization, might have been years ago. and all of a sudden everybody's gone that was involved in that program, and the policy sits on the back of the elevator door, and nobody really knows. A couple of things. First of all, that means that the accountability wasn't built into the policy properly. There wasn't a proper succession in terms of people who might take over that accountability over time. The second thing I'd note, even if everybody's still there that wrote the policy, that was the sort of the point I made about consensus. A policy isn't any good if it's just one person, right? So you could have the CEO of your organization or your ED write a policy and it looks really good and it's just fantastic. Up it goes on the back of the elevator door, and nobody in the organization is really aware of it or bought into it. So I think there's a couple of mechanistic things that you can do to address avoiding that tokenism.
Good.
Yeah, I'll just add to that policies need to be authentic in a real sense, and that comes from the construction of the piece and the fact that it has been built in a collaborative way, in ways that everybody's had an opportunity to get buy-in in the organization. And so when it's finally put out there, you know that it's a real expression of something that the organization wants to do and achieve. And that's what I mean by an authentic policy.
I'll just add, one of the things that we've seen is companies will have, I'll use an example of an anti-harassment and discrimination policy. And so that's the policy. And then in their engagement surveys, where they're asking employees about, sometimes these are every 1 or 2 years, a set of questions that go out to really evaluate the engagement of all their employees. They will ask questions on is it an effective policy? Is the anti-harassment policy effective? Is it working? So there's sort of two parts to it. One is the policy, and then the perception could be within your own workforce, is it effective? And then, of course, the other one is the more public view of your policy with your customers and indeed the Indigenous workforce more generally. So thanks for that question. I see the chat.
One more thing that I think is worth mentioning. Craig and I spent a good chunk of last year helping some banks with strategies to help them improve their Indigenous inclusion through employment. And every single one of these organizations was authentic, came to the question for all the right reasons, and were really struggling to maintain Indigenous employees for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons given by some of the Indigenous employees that we talked to was that it's fine to have a policy. The policy is great, and the company believes in the policy, and the company's implementing the policy. They're accountable, all of the good things. But there's a whole bunch of things that aren't in the policy that are really important to maintaining Indigenous employees, like understanding the culture, reflecting the culture in the workplace, respectfulness to the culture. And these aren't things that are easy to write into a policy document. And it's a lot of it is about awareness of the management and the HR folk in terms of what does this culture mean? Why is this culture so valuable and important? And then reflect it in the workplace. So I think we actually heard the word tokenism, that, oh, well, I'm just being counted. I'm just here because I'm an Indigenous face, right? And that was not the organization's intent. But that you can get that, right? You can get that blowback just simply by not having a high enough level of awareness.
We have a question, another question here, good question. And the question is this from Julianne. It's a question of effectiveness. How do you measure the effectiveness of Indigenous employment policies? What are some mechanisms to determine the effectiveness? Greg, do you want to tackle that one first?
Well, I think that, Stephen, you went into so-called procedural policies, and procedural policies inevitably have a set of metrics attached to it that provide evidence of the sort of success or penetration of the policy in whatever goal or objective it's trying to achieve. So good policies meet the objectives, and they're in an ideal way, there should be metrics attached to whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Now that becomes really, really difficult in some areas. So for example, if we look at reconciliation, we've seen reconciliation policies out there. Now reconciliation is super important. And it's difficult, though, for organizations to evidence and to track the degree and extent to which they have gone down this path of reconciliation and how far they've met success with it, because the metrics are not clear. So reconciliation is an important aspiration that many organizations want to grapple with, want to achieve, and so on. But it becomes more difficult in these kinds of policy objectives to really track, just how far along the journey they are, and what means the organization have to evidence that they have done so. So it's a complicated question. That's one answer. Stephen or Kelly, you might have some other examples.
Stephen? It's a very tricky one, because you're always going to be walking the tightrope between what's too much and what's not enough. If you have too much and you're trying to measure too much, or your expectations are too high, and you're holding people accountable, then you're setting yourself up for some failure. If you don't have enough, then you're not going to necessarily meet your achievement or achieve your expectations, even at a low level. A lot of this, in my experience, comes down to how you hold the people responsible for the accountability bit. Is it tied to their pay? If it's not, are they really going to care? If it's too much of their pay, then they're going to maybe spend too much time on it. And so, you know what I mean? There's going to be a balancing act. And again, back to my earliest point, I don't think one size fits all here. And I think it's going to fit. Your own organization has to figure out what would work within your own culture.
Thank you. So folks, what we're going to do now